So, and the relational challenge, because of all these things that I'm talking about, because women are expected to put the needs of others first and have internalized those behaviors, they may not notice some of the gender bias, and they may not notice the ways that they actually put their partners first. So I find that this is a huge issue in a therapeutic relationship. Well, I need to do this for her, and well, of course I need to pick up the kids because she works late, and of course I need to, and have you talked about this? Have you discussed this? Have you said, this is stressing me out? Can we rearrange how we're doing things? It's often difficult to do that. And I also think these are these societal messages. So, I would say on the surface, most lesbians have rejected the societal messages. I mean, they don't sort of consciously internalize them. But there's also these messages in the lesbian community and the queer community about being Amazons. I mean, you're supposed to be able, to build your own house, with one arm tied behind your back. I mean, that's women. So it's almost like that cultural role of the super mom. That you're supposed to be able to do everything, and that it's hard to admit to weakness, it's hard to admit that our relationship is in trouble, those kinds of issues. Power and conflict. We talked about there being a more egalitarian division of labor. Women tend to use communication as a way to manage conflict. They tend to actually say, there's a problem, we need to talk about it, and that is valued for both of the women as an important thing to do. That decision making, as I said earlier, is shared, and because they're committed to balancing their autonomy and their attachment, there's often the power and conflict is often at a lower level. That the two women want to satisfy each other. However, and again, this is, mini module we should put together, but I want to be really clear that even though power and conflict tends to be egalitarian and communicative, does not mean we should not be assessing for domestic violence. It doesn't mean that we need not to be asking those kinds of questions about both physical hitting and also psychological things, because our research shows that there is as much violence in lesbian relationships as there are in heterosexual relationships and gay male relationships. So it sometimes might be more subtle. It might not have the same kind of you're my wife and go do what I said kind of dynamic that you might see in some heterosexual marriages, but it doesn't mean that there's not going to be violence or abuse or psychological abuse in relationships. So I thought my last slide I would just talk about sex for a little bit, because if I keep saying lesbian sex is invisible and then I don't talk about it, I'm just contributing to it, right? So research has shown that there is less frequency in lesbian relationships than there are, again, we're comparing here. So I don't even know, whoever came up with the idea that we should be comparing different kinds of couples. But if that's what we're doing, there's less frequency in lesbian couples than there is in straight couples and in gay male couples. But there's higher satisfaction. So it's kind of, again, we could do a whole hour discussion on what does that mean? So people are having less sex, but they're actually quite satisfied with the sex that they're having. And some of the problem might be that the methodology of the research, how sex is getting defined. And I will share a personal story that I just recently went to a new gynecologist who said to me, do you have any pain on intercourse? It's an interesting question, right? So I said, well, I'm a lesbian. She said, so, same question. I was sort of like, here's my card, give me a call, you have a lot to learn here about how to do this. But, what are we defining? Is sex only being defined as intercourse, as penetration? Is sex only being defined if it's genital? So, and most of these studies are defining sex in a very narrow way, so it might look like lesbians are actually having a lot less sex than they're actually having. I mean, if touching is not considered sex but foreplay, and all you're doing, even the language of it, all you're doing is touching, then did you have sex? Did we have sex last night or didn't we have sex last night? So there's a question about that. Questions about inhibition. that, you know, we talked about the fact that most women in this culture have certainly not been raised to say, you know, go out and get you some. You know, that's not our cultural context. So women might be a little more shy about initiating sex with one another. I actually, true story, a lesbian couple I worked with many years ago came in with a lot of issues, not one of them not being sex, but I asked them at some point appropriately, I said, you know, how's your sex life? And they both got very, very, very quiet, very uncomfortable, hardly looking at one another. One of them was turning sort of beet red, and one of them finally said, you know, we really don't have sex. We haven't had sex in, you know, close to 10 years probably. And I said, how come? And she said, well, every time I tried, you know, she kind of said she wasn't in the mood. So I just stopped asking. And again, I cannot imagine that dynamic in a straight couple. You know, why haven't you had sex in 10 years? I tried a few times and she said no, so that was it. That was just it for 10 years. I mean, maybe, you know, for a month, maybe for 6 months, you know, maybe, you know, after the triplets were born. But really, like, never again to sit down and say, hey, babe, we need to talk about what's going on here. So that kind of goes against what I said earlier, that lesbian couples are communicative. In that case, they were not communicative at all. But again, to be able to talk about your sex life, you need to be able to talk, and you need to be able to talk about sex. And we know that most people can't talk about sex. And I just think the piece that I want to say is about intimacy. That the value for lesbians across all of the studies that are done are not how big was your orgasm, or how many toys can you play with, or how often you're having it. It's how close they feel. It's how safe and intimate and committed and relational. And I think that's the piece, is the relational piece.